So we have to get after it. Okay, now does everybody have a syllabus? So you're going to use syllabus, okay? We're okay? Okay. And if you need one of the books, there are 2 required books. The first one is The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work by John Gottman. It's in the syllabus. And it's about $13 on Amazon. I think that's the best way to get it. That one. And the second one is Solution Focused Pastoral Counseling. This is about $15. But, give you a deal tonight. If you want one, I can give it to you for 10. Okay? I have 3 of those left. And this other one is for extra credit. It's called Hold Me Tight, and it's by Sue Johnson. This would be the 3rd book. If you know, one of those real overachievers and you want to get extra credit, this is a good one too. Okay? And that's also on Amazon. It's about 15, and if you want it, it's $10. Okay? All right. Now, when it comes to the books in the syllabus, I kind of outline the pace that you should be reading. But what you're going to be tested on, we have 2 tests, the midterm and the final. And don't worry about those. You'll do well on those. I hadn't really been in school. Well, I had long breaks between school. Got my Master's of Divinity about 2000. Then I went back on active duty in the Army. I just retired as a chaplain on Saturday. Signed out on terminal leave. Yeah. But I hadn't been in school in a long time, and I went to Command and General Staff's College in Hawaii in 2012. I didn't like that at all, but nobody ever does. And then I went to Columbus State in 2015 for a Master's in Counseling. It had been a long time since I'd taken tests. You know, when I was in school, you kind of figure out how to take tests. You know, there's a strategy to it. But if you don't use it, you lose it. And I kind of lost it. I still did well, but it was a lot of fretting, a lot of extra studying, and all that stuff. So as long as you pay attention in class, you take notes, you'll do fine on the tests. Now, before the 2 tests, the midterm and the final, we'll review what you need to know. Okay? All right? And that's just what we talk about in class. The books are for your book reports, your book reviews. Okay? All right. The main thing I'm interested in this class is for you to internalize some of these tools so that you can use them for your own ministries. And if you're in a Bible college, you've got a ministry. Now, you may not realize how extensive your ministry is, but chances are it's a lot more than you think. People are looking at you, they're watching you. They'll turn to you when they have problems, okay? So what I'd like to do tonight is to go over some practical counseling skills, okay? Some practical counseling skills. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, okay? What is pastoral or Christian counseling? I mean, there's a lot of different definitions for that. And there are some people that think they have a whole system of Christian counseling. I don't think so. I don't think so. It's not that there's a Christian counseling theory. It's that there's Christian counselors. And if you're a Christian counselor, that's going to come out in who you are. That's going to come out as how you counsel. Okay, so should you use Scripture? Yeah. Should you use Scripture that first session? Maybe? Chances are no. some of the best witnessing opportunities I've had, some of the best opportunities for evangelism that I've had with my clients. I was, until Saturday, the Family Life Chaplain at Fort Bliss. Some of the best opportunities I had for sharing the gospel, which is my ultimate goal, and I'm sure it's your ultimate goal too. We want people to come to Christ. That is ultimately what they need. But when they come in for counseling, you got to stop the bleeding. When people go to an emergency room, when they go to a trauma room, the first thing you have to do is you have to stop the bleeding. And once the bleeding is stopped, then you can start to deal with some of the more significant problems. I mean, cancer will kill you, but it's not going to kill you as fast as bleeding out will. Does that make sense? Okay. Looking for opportunities to share, to witness, and there's ways that you can get Scripture across, scriptural principles, without quoting chapter and verse. Okay. All right. I've seen some so-called Christian counseling where, and I've seen chaplains do this, and I might have been guilty of it at times. When I first started really counseling is when I was a battalion chaplain, 2002 in the 3rd Infantry Division at Fort Stewart. And it was through an infantry battalion. I had 800 soldiers, and the kind of things that they would struggle with and deal with wasn't anything like I'd seen in the local church as a pastor and as a missionary. Have you ever seen Jerry Springer? You know? Ooh, man. You know, I used to think that stuff was all made up. Well, it's not. There are people that actually have these problems, and it's like, you wonder, how did you get yourself into that? Come on. So I realized that I didn't have the counseling skills that I needed, and that's true for many chaplains. We fall back on what we're comfortable with. And what are we comfortable with? Well, Scripture. Give them Scripture. We fix them. That doesn't fix them. Yeah. There's a time and there's a place. But you have to look for your opportunities. And you have to be sensitive to give them what they need when they need it. Not when we're uncomfortable or not when we're frustrated, we don't know what to say. All right. God can use all these various counseling theories. I don't know how many counseling theories there are. There are lots of counseling theories. But God can use them because you're the counselor, you're the man or the woman of God, and He can use these theories through you. One of the things I thought was interesting when I went through my training, I went through the Family Life Chaplain course at Fort Benning, Georgia. And the way it worked is we did our practicum. We saw clients that would come to the counseling center for counseling. Individuals, couples, families, and we saw clients. We had a goal, the minimum for the year was 300 counseling hours. So we had a lot of people coming in. And then we went to Columbus State in Columbus, Georgia, and then we got our master's in counseling. And then we had lots of supervision. We had supervision at the Pastoral Institute, which was a counseling center, a town Christian counseling center in town. We would get supervision from our chaplain supervisors, and we get supervision at the college. The other chaplains that went through this course with me, there were 4 of us, and we had some civilian interns, 4 civilian interns. But these 4 chaplains, we were really close. We did everything together. We had all the same classes. We were at the center. We saw each other constantly, saw each other every day. Now, thankfully, we all got along. We were good friends. That works. We studied together. We wrote our papers together. If it was a take-home test, sometimes we took our test together too. On the buddy system, I guess I shouldn't have said that. Yeah, we're soldiers. We watch each other back. But we did all this stuff together. Had all the same supervision and everything. And so I thought we would use the same counseling theories. But we didn't. Someone asked us, one of our supervisors asked us, okay, what counseling theories do you use? The top two. And everybody had different ones that they used. For me, it's cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and solution focused. And when it comes to couples, I use John Gottman's theories primarily. But we all have different theories, and that's fine. That's fine. As you study some theories, some of them may click with you. That works for me. That suits my way of thinking. That kind of suits how I see the world. And for others, it doesn't. And that's fine. Okay? All right. Now let's talk a little bit about some of these theories. Now the one I said that I use primarily is cognitive behavioral therapy. Now that was started by Albert Ellis. And Albert Ellis based his theory on, it's not what happens to you, it's how you think about it. And he based a lot of his theories on the Stoic philosophers, in particular Epictetus. That's Epictetus, Epictetus. And Epictetus said, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. So it's not what happens to you, it's what you think about it. It's how you frame it in your mind. Now Shakespeare, long after said, about 1,500 years later said, in Hamlet, there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's not what happens to you, it's what you think about it. It's how you frame it. Is that scriptural? Is that principle scriptural? I think it is. I think it is. The very first paragraph in the New Testament to be written, that is chronologically, the books that we have in the New Testament, the way that they're assembled wasn't the order in which they were written. The first book of the New Testament was James. Followed by 1 Thessalonians. The first one of the Gospels wasn't Matthew, it was Mark. But in James, the first verse, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So, when you go through a trial, how do you think about it? Consider it all joy. It's not the suffering, it's not the struggle, it's what am I learning out of this? What am I gaining out of this? What is God teaching me out of this? And so there is a basic, I think, truth, scriptural principle. Does that make sense? Okay. Now here's some of the theories. We're not going to talk about too much theory, but you should at least be aware of some of them. Cognitive behavioral therapy is the one, and we'll talk more about this later, but that's the one that's the most popular, the most common. And I'm glad to hear that, because for what it's worth, I think it's the most effective. It's the leading theory for treating PTSD. It's the leading theory for treating trauma and anxiety, and it makes sense. It's how you think, okay? There's also solution focused, which we're reading about. There's Client-Centered Therapy by Carl Rogers. And really, all counselors kind of do that to a point. This client-centered therapy where you're listening, and you're listening very carefully. But Carl Rogers wouldn't give any kind of challenge or advice. He would just listen. And then he'd say, well, I hear you saying this, and he'd reflect it back to them. That was it. I think people need a little more than that. But he was very good at really listening to people instead of just trying to fix them. Now, do you think men or women are better natural counselors? Women. There's no question about it. It's women. Because women want to talk about their feelings. They don't want you to fix them. When guys hear something we want to fix it, right? Don't we? Of course we do. Yeah. But some of these problems really can't be fixed. Some of them are being, you help them, you fix them by listening, letting them talk it out. So not falling into that temptation to just fix it. And I've seen ministers do this, I've seen chaplains do this, to just give a scripture and they're fixed. They're not fixed. All right, so Carl Rogers, there's Alfred Adler's theory, or Adlerian theory, which I kind of like. He spent a lot of time talking about birth order. He thought the birth order that the family you came into was very significant. I don't know about that. I can see that somewhat. But he was very big on encouragement. Encouragement is a huge part of counseling. And you see it running through all the different theories. It's one of those principles, one of those strings that is so important. Now, what does it mean to encourage? Edify. It means to edify, to build up. Specifically, if we look at the word, it means to impart courage. When you encourage someone, you're helping them to have courage, helping them to face life. And of course, we do that by edifying people. How would we use encouragement in solution focused?
Encourage them to identify the problem.
Okay, so you ask them, remember we talked last week about a scaling question. Where are you at today? Like on a scale of 1 to 10. And other theories use scaling questions too. I'm about a 4. Okay, well, what can you do to improve on that next week? Well, I can do this, I can do that. Okay, And so when you see them the following week, you ask them, how did it go? Where are you at today? Well, I was at a 4 last week. I'm at a 6 this week. A 6? How did you go up to a 6? What happened? And so you get them to tell you about it. What went right? And you build them up. You genuinely build them up on these positive changes in their lives. Do more of what works, less of what doesn't. If they were at a 4 and now they're at a 2, what went wrong? And you talk through that, and then encourage them for the following week to make positive changes, take responsibility for their lives, make these positive changes to do better the following week. Okay? So encouragement. Have you ever heard of EMDR? EMDR. Has anybody heard of EMDR? Okay. It's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. There are some people that are really into it, and it has to do with eye movement and the right and the left side of the brain and how We process memories. And if you're going to do EMDR with a person, now you can do fingers, and you say to them, okay, now watch my finger. Or you could tap their knees. Or you could use lights, have flashing lights. There's some people that are really into this. I'm not sold on it myself. Now, some theories work for some people. It didn't really work for me. I just thought it was kind of, maybe I'm explaining it in a creepy way. I didn't really like it, It just seemed kind of pop psychology to me, or a little psychobabblish, but some people use it effectively. I think what makes it effective isn't this thing. It's focusing on where you're hurting and really thinking about that and having someone right there with you, present with you, working you through it. I think that's the good that comes out of it. I don't really think the theory itself is that effective, at least not for me. But it is one of those popular ones that's out there, and they're using it for trauma. Okay. There's behavioral approaches. There's reality approaches, which focus on taking responsibility, stressing right and wrong, which we agree with. There's attachment theories by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And those are interesting, talking about how we grew up, who was important in our life, who showed us love, who showed us guidance, who was there to encourage us and protect us. And those attachments are very important. It always irritates me when I say that or when I hear that, because I think, hey, we're adults. Why should things that happened to us when we were children, when we were helpless, stay with us all throughout our lives? They do. Because that's the paradigm. That's the foundation. And it's difficult to go back and work through those things that stay with us. Okay. And there's Gestalt therapy by Fritz Perls. Now, Fritz Perls said it wasn't what happened in the past. It's what's happening now. It's what's happening here now. That's what's important. And he's known for the empty chair technique. Has anybody ever heard of that? Empty chair technique. It's kind of interesting. I've used it a couple of times. With most clients, I wouldn't use it because I'm just not that comfortable with it. Haven't had a lot of success with it. But for some people, it really works well. So, the way the empty chair technique works. Say I had this one soldier that I saw in Korea, and he had just so much resentment and bitterness toward his parents. Now, he was abused when he was a child, had gotten in a lot of trouble, and he was actually getting kicked out of the army, and these troubles followed him. But one of the things that seemed to work for him, and I'd seen him maybe 7 or 8 times, and you try to like your clients, you try to like people that you counsel. Sometimes you don't. I don't like this guy. He's just such a downer, But the thing that seemed to work best with him was the empty chair. Getting him to, okay, imagine that chair, and sitting in that chair is your father. What would you say to him? If you had the opportunity, what would you say to him now? or your mother? What would you say to her? And they kind of play through it. Some of them have a very hard time. They can't really get there. But that is an effective technique to use it. It's helpful to get that out. Sometimes the person is long dead. Been gone 20 years. But talking it through, not to me, but to that chair representing that person, sometimes it helps. All right. Okay, now, here's the bottom line. Here's the most important thing you're going to hear, probably in this course. And it is definitely going to be on your final, in your midterm. Probably be on both, because it's so important. 80% of your effectiveness as a counselor, and it doesn't matter if you're not a professional counselor, if people come to you and turn to you, you're a counselor. 80% of the effectiveness of your work as a counselor isn't your theory. And research has proven this. Research has proven this. People that have a vested interest in all these theories have admitted it. 80% is so what's the exact term? Let me check my notes here. It's the therapeutic alliance. The therapeutic alliance between the counselor and the client and the counselor. It's the therapeutic alliance. It's the relationship that you have with your client and how they feel about you. So it's that human connection. Now, I do think the theories are helpful and they work. It's one of the things that helped me as a counselor. I tried to be a counselor on my own as a chaplain, as a battalion chaplain, and as a brigade chaplain, and then mentoring other chaplains. And we were all kind of frustrated because we really didn't know where we were going, in terms of a theory. The theories really help, and they work. But the most important thing is the connection you have with your client. Okay, remember that you're going to see that again. Having said that, the most important part of this therapeutic alliance is to listen. Listen, listen, listen. And that is not as easy as it sounds. That is not as easy as it sounds. How do you feel when someone really listens to you? Like they care? How does it make you feel about yourself? Great. Makes you feel great. Makes you feel significant. Makes you feel competent. Makes you feel like you matter. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this particular preacher. He's been gone a while. C.S. Lewis. Say, well, we all heard of C.S. Lewis. If you haven't heard of C.S. Lewis, I would question your salvation. But C.S. Lewis, my favorite book of his, he's my favorite author, Mere Christianity. He got the name Mere Christianity from J. Sidlow Baxter in England. Now, J. Sidlow Baxter is a very famous preacher. He's kind of like the J. Vernon McGee of England. I heard him speak 5 times. He came and spoke to our church in San Diego Skyline Wesleyan Church. Came and did a series, and that was the first time that I'd heard really good preaching. Now he's with the Lord. That was like 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. He was 80 at the time. But after one of his talks, one of his messages, he had his book table, and I got one of his books, and I waited in a long line to talk to him afterwards. And I asked him a question. I don't know what I asked, but I'm only like 19, maybe 20, and I wanted him to sign his book. And so he's tired, you know. He's taught this message. He's an older guy. All these other people have talked to him. And when I came up to him, he listened to everything that I said. He kind of turned his head so he could hear better, and he looked right in my eyes, and he heard everything that I said. And you know, I really felt good about that. All these years later, I still remember that. That's so important. But I've also had experiences where I've talked to other preachers who would just look past you, you know. They would kind of talk to you and it was superficial and just kind of looking past you to somebody more important. Yeah, yep. How does that make you feel? If I told you who the preacher was, you'd probably recognize his name, but I'm not going to do that. I don't want to name drop the guy, but he's very famous. Lots of his books, lots of books on leadership. I thought he was a terrible leader, you know. I was an intern at this church, so I kind of saw what it was like behind the scenes. It was a mega church. But it was like behind the scenes, and that was pretty disillusioning, you know. It's very important when we listen. Now, if you're going to be effective with people, the most important thing that you can do, or you should do, is to really listen. When I'm talking to clients, one of the things that makes it easier for me to really listen to them, to really focus in on what they're saying, is because I'm listening for clues. Because the problem that people come in for is almost never the real problem. It's something else. It's something deeper. I was talking to my counseling supervisor at Fort Bliss. He works in addiction medicine, getting my Texas license. So he's my counseling supervisor. Great guy, Alec Kessick. And he said that in Texas, he'd heard that, well, the Supreme Court was going to legalize gambling in all 50 states. And he said, you know, Steve, this may be a good thing for us to look into as far as getting training on how to be, you know, like counselors that deal with gambling addiction. Because when it's more common and it's more prevalent, we're going to see a bigger problem with it. And I think that's probably true. So I lost my point. I'm still thinking about gambling.
You can mention who that pastor was then.
Oh yeah, I don't want to mention that guy. But it's so important to listen carefully, listening for clues. Some problems that people have I work, Moto and I were talking before class about suicide. And every month, I lead a support group for, it's a grief support group for Survivor Outreach Services on post. It's for Gold Star families. Now, a Gold Star family is a family that had a service member die. When I started leading this 2 years ago, it's once a month, and the chaplains buy them a meal, and we eat dinner together, and then we, have a support group. I thought it would be families that were there because their loved one was killed in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria. Now, something like that. Or maybe an accident. Soldiers get killed in accidents all the time, especially on motorcycles. There were a few of those, but about 80% of this support group were there because of suicide. Their loved ones had killed themselves, which is a huge problem in the military. It's a huge problem all across the world. The last 30 years, it's spiked all over the world. But when they've had that kind of suffering and that kind of death in their life, how can you really fix them? One of my clients, my favorite client, who left, her husband got out of the Army, and they went back home to Indiana. Now this client, she'd been raped by a stepfather. She was 15. And re-traumatized, and most rape victims are re-traumatized. It happens again. I don't know why. It happened again with a friend that they trusted, and he raped her. I guess it's about a year ago now. Well, she got out of the Army, and she had really changed. She would come into my office, and when we first started meeting, and she would just cry. And would just cry. And if somebody's crying, what should you do? You let them cry. Now, at least my instinct was, oh, come on, they're there. Oh, don't cry. But when I learned about counseling, when I went through counseling myself, crying is good for you. It's a release that God has given us. After you've had a good cry, don't you feel better? Yeah. And so she would come in and cry every week. Not the whole time. Not the whole time, but she cried every week. Kind of became sort of a joke, with us. But it was good for her. It was good for her. Well, I think she'd really become strong. She'd really internalized cognitive behavioral therapy. When she started to go down that path of letting her thoughts, feeling like a victim and blaming herself and all the other things, she would use some of these techniques for thinking through trauma, to not let herself go there, And she'd really progressed. I was really proud of her. Well, she goes home, and she's very close to her younger sister. She saved her younger sister from her stepfather. When she was raped, she reported it. Didn't tell her mom, because mom's part of the problem. But she told the school counselor. Then the police got involved, but nobody helped in the situation. So she lived with her grandmother for a while. But because she made such an issue of this, even though she wasn't listened to, and even though she was blaming the victim, she saved her sister from the same thing happening. Well, her sister, beautiful girl, 19 years old, but a diabetic. She has to take shots, had to take shots for years. just suddenly died last week. So I'm thinking about my friend, my client, and we're still friends. What do you say to someone who loses a husband, a wife, a child, a sister, a brother? There's some things you just can't say. You have to be there with them. But the fact that you're there with them, that you're listening, that you're caring, helps. Okay? All right. So, always remember that you can listen. Now, what happens if you're stumped? If you don't know what to say, you don't know where this is going, you can always ask a question. You can always ask a question. You can say, how did that make you feel? What was that like for you? What happened next? You can always ask a question. Now, try to stay on topic. Try to make your question therapeutic. You're not there to chat. You're there to help the other person. You're there for therapy. Now, you want to build a rapport, but sometimes it's a fine line between building a rapport and just chatting because you're afraid to get into the real problems. You're there to work. You're there to help them. And that means challenging them, challenging their thinking on some things. But you can always ask a question, and you can listen. You can, as you're watching them for clues, are they fidgeting? Is there foot tapping, Or when you ask a particular question, are they responding in a particular way? And ask them about that. What's going on there? Why are you doing that? Or I noticed that when you said this, you kind of had a catch in your voice. Or when you talked about that, your eyes start watering. Follow that emotion. Talk about it. And the more that you can get them to talk, the more that you can listen, that's therapeutic. That helps them. And, of course, we don't have to have all the answers. I had one client. We've got about 5 more minutes. Or 7 more minutes. I had one client. She was one of my first at Fort Benning. And she's an older lady. She's like 65. And her husband had died about 4 years ago. And so she came in and she told me she's very depressed. She looked very depressed. Kind of, I don't want to say disheveled, a little bit, Looked tired, weary. She's very down, very sad. And so she told me that her husband died 4 years ago, and it was a blood clot. And so he was in his late 50s, which to me sounds very young. It just keeled over and died. And she found him on the back porch, very traumatic. Well, a couple of months later, about 3 or 4 months, her dad died. Now, she's very close to her father. Her mom had died when she was in high school, and she was very close to her dad. And they all lived in that general area of Columbus, Georgia, and Phoenix City, Alabama, in that that area there. So the family was close. She saw her dad a lot. And then he died just like 2 or 3 months later. And then about 2 or 3 months later, her older sister died. And then finally, she had a little dog that she'd had for like 13 years. And then he died. And she said, you know, I just kind of shut down. She did have this going for her. She belonged to a good church there in Columbus. In fact, we went to the same church. She belonged to a good church, and she was involved in a ladies' a book reading club. But she said that there were a couple of years there where I don't remember anything that happened. I don't remember anything that happened during those years. She said she just shut down. Excuse me. So she knows she lived, you know, she would eat and sleep, but nothing else. And so she was stuck in the grieving process. Now there's 5 stages of grief. We'll talk about this again next time, but just quickly. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 60s came out with 5 stages of grief. The first one is denial. The second is anger. The third is bargaining. The fourth is depression. And the fifth is acceptance. Now, people don't always go through those in order. Most do. Sometimes you can start to go through them, and then something will happen, and you're going to start over again. But you can get stuck. With those people at the grief support group I lead, they're stuck with suicide. And we've talked about this, and they say, yeah, I'm stuck. You can get overloaded. You can get overwhelmed. And your mind just can't get you past that. And so my friend Mary, she was stuck in her grief. Overwhelmed. All of that at once. She just couldn't get through it. Okay, so you got 4 minutes. What would you do?
The word defeated keeps coming to mind, like she just gave up, like I said, it's around
Yeah. Now she has a son who's divorced, but he's got a little girl, a little 10-year-old daughter, so she's got a granddaughter. Got a good church. She's okay financially. But how would you, if you were talking to her, how would you try to help her through this grief that she's stuck in?
Well, I feel pain because from 2010 to 2017, I lost 1 person every year. So I would support her
Okay.
and just let her cry and get out. I would also tell her what I did. I went to the Lord on each occasion, and the Lord walked me through everything.
Okay.
And that's what I tell everybody when I know they lose children or their parents. You know, I tell them, if you go to the Lord and just get in fellowship with Him and just pour it out, that's the best way.
Okay.
At least that's what I found for me, and I would think that it would do for the same for the other person as
Yeah.
well.
And be there with her. Yeah.
To focus on what she has, her granddaughter, her son, on living
Yeah. Yeah.
for what she has, to be
Yeah.
grateful for what she has.
Yeah.
Or never, I just be there.
Yeah. I didn't really know what to do. Most of my counseling has been with, now I'm very close to several older people in my life. I was close to my grandparents and other older people in the church, but I was never a counselor. You know, it was always kind of the other way around. Most of my counseling has been done with college-age people and military people and young adults, 30-somethings, 40-somethings. So this was a challenge. But I thought, my grandmother, very close to my grandmother passed away 8 years ago. And even now, I love any opportunity I can to talk about my grandma, you know, any chance I get. So I thought maybe if I could ask her questions about her husband and get her to tell me all about him. And she liked that. So she told me all about him, where they spent their vacations, and, you know, for several weeks. And as she was talking to me about this, I noticed she was dressing nicer, she seemed more cheerful, she seemed happier, she was smiling. It was helping her. And so at a certain point, maybe it was a month or 2 months, something like that, she said, she's a Southern lady, she said, now I'd like to talk about my daddy. So let's talk about your daddy. So then she told me all about her dad, and then her sister, and then she was through. And then we could start talking about her resources, you know, what she had to live for. She saw her son several times a week. What a blessing that is. I don't see my son. My son's in Japan teaching English. I don't see my boy. So she saw her son several times a week, and that beautiful little granddaughter who I met her at church. That's a blessing. And so then she could start thinking not about what she lost, but what she had to live for. And that helped her. And we would talk about the Lord, we would pray together, because she was very clearly a Christian, and that was part of our time together. Yeah. All right.
So you encouraged her attachments?
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Now, I mean, we should grieve those that we've lost. And the tears that we have for them, that's the cost of loving. That's the cost of love. It's part of the love. That's the grieving process. But they wouldn't want us to stop living. You know, if something happened to me on the way home, if I were in a car accident and I were killed, I wouldn't want my wife and my daughter and my son and my mom who lives here now to stop living. I want them to maybe grieve a bit, but then get on with their lives and enjoy their life. Now, if something does happen to me on the way home, you'll go, he knew. I don't think I know. But if I do, out of body, present with the Lord. Yeah. Okay.
You were in that class next week.
Yeah. You wouldn't have class.